Good morning, everyone, and good evening to our speaker, Ms. Lita Nelsen in Boston. I'm Xiang Zhao, Deputy Director of HKU TTO, joined our office from MIT last July. Today, we are thrilled to have invited Lita, sharing her successful experience and insights in cultivating entrepreneurship during her tenure at MIT in the past 30 years. As the first sharing session, in a while, we plan to have two more down the road, one on technology and licensing and another on innovation IP management. As per the Chief Innovation Officer of HKU, Dr. Yiwu He, so the direction and support to build an innovative and sustainable horizontal ecosystems in technology transfer at HKU, we started and have been engaging with Lita since last mid-April this year. We're fortunate to have her on board as our consultant to bring her new insights and best practice to HKU community. And eventually, we hope to create a positive impact and sell all of us through our challenging yet rewarding entrepreneurship journey. Lita and I, we knew each other in mid-2015 when I went back to MIT working at the Industrial Liaison Program as a program director. And I will introduce her with her brief bio for the sake of the time. Lita Nelsen spent 30 years in Technology and License Office of MIT, 25 of them as a director of office. During that time, MIT TTO licensed over 500 startup companies based on MIT research technology. She is the author of many articles and books, chapters on the technology transfer. During her tenure at MIT TLO, she was invited to lecture at a consultant in tech transfer and a university-based entrepreneurship in over 20 countries around the world. She was a co-founder of Praxis, now called Praxis on the Oriel, a UK nonprofit company for training tech transfer professionals, or which she was awarded a member of a British Empire by the UK government. Having retired from MIT just recently, Lita is now a consultant for young startup licensing technology from universities. She is now she volunteers as a mentor working on starting companies. And her presentation title is today, How MIT Fosters Entrepreneurship. And please use in Q&A and also chat sections to post your questions. And my colleagues, Catherine and Emily, will pick up and deliver questions to Lita after her presentation. With that, I'm turning the stage to Lita now. Lita.
Thank you very much, and good morning, or in my case, good evening, I guess. I'm very pleased to be here. It's been interesting to listen to Sean and to Dr. He as to how HKU is expanding its efforts in tech transfer and in entrepreneurship. MIT has long been known as place where the alumni often form companies. There was a report by Professor Ed Roberts of the Sloan School of Business, Sean knows him, said that over history, 30,000 active, that is still alive companies, had at least one MIT alum as a founder. Together, they employ over 4 million people and an annual revenue of $1.9 trillion. more on that culture, 25% of all living MIT alumni have been a founder of at least one company during their lifetime. And the trend's accelerating because they took a recent survey of alumni graduating in the first 5 years after graduation. 11%, 1 out of 9 alumni were involved, had been founders of a company. Next slide. But what I'm going to be talking about is entrepreneurship based on licenses to intellectual property, patents mostly, that have come out of MIT research. As Sean mentioned earlier in my bio, MIT is licensing to startups started by faculty and students, about 20 a year for the last 30 years, meaning we're 500 to 600 startups. 90% of these are licensed to patents, maybe more than 90%, and a small fraction to software. Approximately 40% are in the biomedical, biopharma, even though MIT has no medical school or hospital, so operates at somewhat of a disadvantage vis-a-vis places like Harvard and Stanford. The vast majority of these 500 or 600 new startups have a faculty member as a co-founder, and I focus on this in deference to this audience. And if they're not founders, they're members of the corporate board or the advisory board of the company. But the vast majority, in fact, I can only think of a handful for which this is not true. The vast majority of the faculty founders remain as faculty at MIT while serving as consultants or advisory board members to the company. Now, I was asked to speak about MIT best practices, so I'll be concentrating on what MIT does and what I've learned while I was there. May I have the next slide, please? I want to emphasize that title we just had that, can you pull this one all the way out? Thank you. MIT, one of the reasons we talk about startups, and I'll talk more about this later, is that we have tried to license our technology to large existing companies, but they aren't interested. And they, at least nowadays, when companies, particularly in the United States and Europe, are concerned with short-term profits and short-term stock prices. Why aren't they interested? Because the inventions coming out of MIT and most universities are very early. They're research results. They haven't shown practical utility, and they certainly haven't shown market acceptance. That is, if it worked, would anyone buy it? And in the case of most of these inventions, perhaps not counting software, before you know whether this invention is going to work practically, that is commercial proof of concept, it may take you millions of dollars to get a commercially ready product to see if it works. This is most typical in pharmaceuticals, where you have to go through years, if not decades, of development, then animal testing, and only then do you even get to find out if it works on humans, and that can be $100 million later. It's also risky. Many of these new inventions will fail, partly because what works in the laboratory doesn't necessarily work at a reasonable price on scale up. And it's a long development time, a long time before the product hits the market, and therefore a long time before the investment is generating profits. The large corporations in the last 20 years have basically said, too early for us, not within our time frame. We don't want a license. So then what? Next slide. We will wait until somebody else, preferably a startup, brings it to us. So I'm not sure this slide is going to work because it's on a different comment. So yeah, I'm sorry, we're on a different system and the slide I have doesn't work here. But I will narrate it rather than show you which. Basically, here's the chain of value. The majority, at least in the US, of university research is funded by the federal government, a good 80 to 90%. So federal government funds it, university does research, an invention comes out, they go to the technology licensing office and say, I think this invention would be useful in the real world. Please file a patent. Then in theory, what we would do was advertise the invention to see who wants it. Well, many universities do it. Even we tried it. It doesn't work with the large existing companies. They say it's too early for all the reasons that I gave in the previous slide. So what happens is we become dependent on the inventors or others forming a startup to raise high-risk capital, venture capital, in which they can develop a technology to a proof of at least commercial potential and commercial possibility. At that point, most of them partner with the larger corporations and take the biotechnology with the pharmaceutical companies and form a partnership whereby ultimately the big company manufactures and markets the product and pays royalties or other payments to the small company, the startup that brought it to that point, or quite frequently, they acquire the company, they acquire the startup. And this has become a major source of growth in companies from Pfizer and Merck to Cisco and others in the electronics field. So this is the market, this is the pathway that MIT's efforts in helping inventors start companies leads ultimately to supplying new technology and new products to the large corporations. Next slide, please. So what do we find helps do it? After all, we're universities, so education is important. And there are formal courses in entrepreneurship, in marketing, in product development. One thing that's a benefit at MIT is it has unusually permeable walls between the schools of science and the school of engineering and the school of business. In fact, if you're an undergraduate and you're in the School of Engineering studying electrical engineering and you want to study biology instead, all it takes is a piece of paper to your advisor and you don't have to be admitted to the other school. More usefully in this particular case is that a student getting a PhD in immunology can take business school, courses a block away at the Sloan School. In addition to educating them, this has the additional advantage that they'll be in a classroom often with a bunch of MBAs who know marketing and who are thinking of starting companies but don't know where to go for technology, and teams form. It's very common And I wish more schools made it easy for students at more universities at one school to take courses at others. Also, there are many short courses, seminars during the independent activity period at MIT in January between semesters that students who are interested can take, not for credit, but to learn. Often taught not by faculty, but by experienced people. It may be people currently employed in industry, or it may be people in the technology license office, or it can be successful alumni who come and show how they did it. Next, but it takes more than that. Next slide, please. Also very important is that there are now probably 20 different organizations within MIT that will provide some form of mentoring to a faculty member or a student, or in some cases, even alumni who are interested in starting companies. What's interesting about these is that most of them, almost all of them, use volunteers, experienced people from the business and investment community who come in and meet with the students or the faculty members under various different organizations. The MIT Venture Mentoring Service has now been in existence for about 25 years. And in fact, it even nowadays teaches how to do it to universities around the world, in Europe, Asia, and the United States. Anybody affiliated with MIT, students, faculty, or in the case of the Venture Mentoring Service, even alumni can come and say, I want advice and mentoring on my company. It's free. MIT takes nothing for it and provides it as a service. A more also very interesting program that I'm a mentor and a volunteer is the MIT Sandbox program. Any student team, and the team can be 2 people or it can be more, who can write 2 paragraphs to say, here's my idea for a company. It may involve MIT technology. It may be a new way to teach piano playing. Whatever it is, if it makes any sense at all, and the student will commit to attending the seminars and meeting with mentors, they will get, at the first phase, $1,000 to allow them to go and talk to customers, talk to other people outside the university to learn whether this is a good idea, what the requirements are, and whether it makes sense to keep going and launching the company. Some students ultimately conclude this is not a good idea. And many of them start over again with a new program. If the first 6 months or a year that they are showing progress and are actually now looking like it might be a real company someday, they can get up to $5,000 for the team. This allows them to buy materials or perhaps pay for airline tickets to go attend an important conference and learn other people. And this is available to any student, undergrad, grad, and graduate students. And it's in every school at MIT, from the MBAs to the undergraduates in science. A third program funded by a very generous man, Deshpande, who'd made a lot of money in technology and wanted to encourage others, gave a large grant in which small research grants are given pre-company. This is for faculty and graduate students to do a little more work on their project and perhaps do the kind of experiments that aren't so much about the basic science, but to show feasibility. It also has mentors, they call them catalysts, but people from the business community to help the scientists figure out what it is they'll have to show to the world to get a company off the ground. And at the business school, the Sloan Business School, Delta V is a summer program in which the students can work full-time and get mentored on their startups. And in some of them in the venture from the Sandbox program can also apply for stipends for housing, et cetera, so they don't feel economically required to go out and get a job for the summer, but can work on their startups. So this is a key element of our best practices. Next slide. The TLO is a key part here in that they are there to get the companies off the ground. If we made some money from them, that's wonderful. But most important is to get the technology licensed and get somebody to invest in developing this very, very early stage technology. Now, the people I hired in TLO, and it's not that typical in most universities, the senior people were people with significant experience in industry, not just at the bench, but involved in product management or marketing. Some had even been CEOs of companies. They came later in their lives, in their 40s, 50s, even a few in this early 60s, as a second career. Probably paid a lot less than they had been making in turn, but could afford to do it and were excited by the possibility. We also were very fortunate in that the upper administration was not primarily measuring in terms of how much cash did we bring in a particular year. They wanted the technology out there, and if it succeeded, then we'd make some money, but most importantly was to get it off the ground and develop. Our TLO was proud of the fact that it was quick, that it was responsive, that it always answered the telephone or the email, and were able to reach agreements promptly at reasonable terms, not the very best we might get if we spent 6 months on it, but if we spend a few weeks on it, get reasonable terms, and get on to the next deal. Also important because startups involve very complex relationships sometimes between the faculty and their companies and their students and the outside world. The TLO people became very familiar with MIT policies, resources where startup inventors could find help, places that can guide the company. And given now the multi-armed ways in which people can get help for startup companies with MIT, we were able to help guide them to the forest and recommend who they should talk to. We also became familiar with external resources, business plan contests, incubators, accelerators. I'll talk about those definitions a little later. And when appropriate, introductions to venture investors. What I say when appropriate is that the venture community learned that when we recommended a particular startup, it certainly wouldn't be a waste of their time. They might not decide to fund it, but we screened very carefully, quite informally, who we sent to them. And therefore, most venture capital firms won't take business plans that just come off the street. Or if they take them, they throw them away right away. So they learned that when we recommended that you should talk to Professor X, they talked to Professor X and things happened. And the other thing is, when you're doing as many as we did, there would undoubtedly be disputes between faculty or between faculty and students, or who knows. And again, the TLOs got the experience, just help with dispute resolution or know where to go for help to get things settled quickly. So that was helpful. Another element, next slide, is that there were role models. You're all scientists and researchers, so you'll know what I mean, that it's exponential. Many people started companies because their colleague in the next lab had started a company, so they could ask and say, who do I go to? How do I do it? Or they could just admire the new car the guy bought based on money that had come from a successful company. So the more people succeeded in this, the more others wanted to do it. And so it kind of, the interest grew exponentially. And also, and this is now taken for granted in universities, but if you go back 25 or 30 years, it was, people weren't sure whether a scientist starting a company would be thought of as not quite interested in science, or maybe it's improper, or why don't they stay in their labs? But when, and will this ruin their reputation in science? Well, when Nobel laureates and future Nobel laureates were starting companies and still doing world-class research, that started to go away. And start this kind of entrepreneurial approach to bringing your science findings into the real world was not only encouraged, but admired. Then was the external ecosystem. People who knew what they were doing in the community, that is, accountants, lawyers, even real estate people who were asked to do short-term leases to crazy little startup companies, became familiar and became skilled with it. We developed angel networks, particularly angel investors, that is, individual investors, who had made their money in the type of technology they wanted to invest in. They were very valuable investors for early stage companies because they understood the technology, they understood the time frame that it would take, and maybe best of all, they had connections to other influential or knowledgeable people in the community. Then we get to real venture capital funds. These are large funds able to invest large amounts of money as required, hundreds of thousands to hundreds of millions. What's important for startup people to know is that most venture capital firms do not invest at the university stage. Instead, it's a small subset of the hundreds of venture capital firms, and they've made a lot of money by knowing how to do early stage stuff. So we're able to help guide the startup people, inventors, into who to talk to. And although when we started doing this in the late 1980s, we could only find those venture firms in New York or in California. And so the earliest companies that we formed had their lead investors outside Massachusetts. Now, if you're anywhere around Cambridge, you will meet early stage venture capitals when you go out for coffee. The big firms started opening offices in the region, the big venture firms, and the big famous ones in New York suddenly had an office in Boston also, and then dozens, if not hundreds, of new firms formed over the following decades. Then we come to what I think of as the most scarce resource, and that's experienced CEOs who are experienced in managing science into products and in managing small companies and raising money and talking with investors. As I've traveled around the world, I've found that they are more scarce than money, than investment money. Because there aren't very many of them, or at least there weren't very many of them. What happens when a region, be it Silicon Valley, San Francisco, or Cambridge, Massachusetts, starts doing a lot of startups, they start to grow their own resource. They start to grow their own CEOs. The CEO of the next biotech company will have learned how to do it by being number 3 at some previous startup biotech company in the region. So again, you develop management talent now, not at the university, but next door in the region, in the city. More things that happened over time and that are a key part of why it's so easy to birth a company is incubators and accelerators. I'll explain that later, where people can get both housing for their company and mentoring. And MIT started, I think, the earliest university business plan contest. Other universities have followed along, but there are also nowadays business plan contests in the region that are being run by venture investors and others. Generally, although not always, they specialize. Some are only for green technology, some are only for biotechnology, and some are for anybody who can tell a good story with a technology base or even another base. So you can see that these new fragile baby companies are now being thrown out of the university into a warm environment that helps grow them. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to give a short interruption for vocabulary. The term accelerator is new. The term incubator had gotten too broad. It was everything from tiny little companies in a cubicle to simply a business park where companies could set up close to universities, large companies even. So now an incubator, still broadly available, is rental space that's willing to do it for relatively short periods of time and situated in the city where there's a major university or many. It's generally designed for startup companies, and it may specialize in certain types of companies. An accelerator is an incubator with often subsidized rent, which in a high rent area like Boston can be critical, includes some educational programs, includes mentoring and perhaps business plan competitions. They usually are competitive. That is, you can't just pay the rent and come in the way you could in many incubators. And they may require partial payment in equity. So some are set up by venture investors. And generally they're time limited. You can stay for a year or maybe two, but then they kick you out and other people come in. Okay. Given that vocabulary, let's go on with the next slide. And that is what MIT doesn't provide. We don't do grants to companies. We don't do grants to the faculty to work on their company's technology. Pre-company, we have a relatively small program for a few companies, which is the Deshpande Center. But other than that, we don't invest in the companies. And we don't even allow them to incubate in our laboratories. The policy forbids the startup company to work in or with MIT research laboratories. This is a controversial decision on the part of MIT. We started it in 1987 when we were doing our first exclusive license to startups. And we were worried about whether there would be a conflict of interest for the faculty as to where to put their efforts in their laboratory, whether there would be worries about confidentiality within the laboratory, so students couldn't talk to each other or talk to others outside. And we worried that students would be exploited to work on what the company wanted to work on rather than the best science project. So we put in this rule. In fact, the company isn't even allowed to sponsor research at MIT in anything related to the work that one of the founders does, the founding professor does. As I said, this is very controversial. In many places, the universities want this to happen. In fact, in many cases, they want the startup company to raise money to support research at the university. And paying for sponsored research becomes part of the payment for the license agreement. So that's the other extreme. And why? So MIT started it early because it wasn't clear how the government would feel about it, or the newspapers, or the publicity. And we said, let's just keep it clean, keep a big wall between the companies and the university. Many of the faculty opposed this because from the viewpoint of benefiting their company, they would love to use MIT resources, particularly in equipment-heavy fields, such as new materials or biotechnology. In biotechnology, you'd have to spend $1 million on equipment to even open the doors of a biotech company. So MIT said, well, we understand it would be to the benefit of the company, but there's too many conflicts. As time went on and we were no longer worried about what the outside world was thinking, nonetheless, this policy was very recently supported and backed up by the Vice President of Research at MIT. It has stood us in good stead to keep the activities separate. That doesn't mean we can't mentor and maybe even pre-company for what we call maker space, encourage the company to get started, but once it's started, it's a separate entity. It shouldn't be employing students, and it shouldn't be working in our laboratories. I put down here because some of you may have heard about the engine. The engine has been called MIT's incubator or accelerator, but it's not. It is an accelerator in Cambridge, in Central Square, if any of you know the region. And it was initially founded by MIT but it's separate. It's a separate organization. It has a venture fund that is not an MIT venture fund. MIT is a limited partner, but there are several other investors, and MIT is not a majority partner. So it's a separate corporation. Why did MIT set it up? Partly because real estate has become so crowded and so expensive in Cambridge that there was no place for the little companies to work without moving out to the suburbs. And that made it more difficult for faculty to consult for the companies. It made it more difficult for the early stages, when the students now graduating were still living in Cambridge. And so it was set up to allow new companies, they don't have to be only MIT companies, but to give them space and where they could do their early year or two. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly through this thing to allow time for questions. Simply talk about the types of investment capital. In contrast to Hong Kong, there is very little government money for the first few years of a company. There's some things called SBIR grants, but they are for special projects and don't work for general funding of the company. Next, so therefore, next slide, please. It's investment capital, friends and family, seed capital from wherever you can get it. Angel investors, that is individual investors or groups of individual investors who invest. And finally, the venture investors. Next slide, please. And very importantly, not usually in the first year, but in the second, third, later years of the company, where partnerships with large corporations who want to be the ultimate marketers of the technology will pay the small company to develop specific products. And this is, quote, non-dilutive capital. It doesn't dilute the stock shares for the inventors and founders, and often leads to marriage. That is, the big company acquires the entirety of the little company. Okay, next slide. I'm going to skip this or go through it very quickly because we covered it before. Why the emphasis on startups? Go back one, please, just quickly. All right. It's to get innovation out into the environment. The large corporations are not doing it. True innovation, not product enhancement. So economic growth is dependent on that innovation. The universities innovate the technology, the science, but they don't develop it. The big companies also are in favor of their startups because this is where their growth is coming through partnering and acquisition. Next slide. So I think what I've shown you is it takes a community to build new companies. In MIT, the community grew with MIT. When I first started as an undergraduate at MIT, Kendall Square was a place, it was a desert, empty vacant lots, old buildings, warehouses, 2 restaurants that you, let's say, didn't guard your health sufficiently if you went there. Now it's got skyscrapers, it's filled with companies. An interesting thing in the pharmaceutical area is that the large international pharmaceutical companies from all over the world have set up either laboratories or development offices in Cambridge to be close to MIT, Harvard, and the source of the startups from which their growth is coming. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. Sean, over to you.
Yes, okay, thank you, Lita. Very inspiring. And also, yeah, next time when we have a chance, we can show Kendall Square video, right? It's so impressive. Okay.
I will
so,
send you some photos I have of one of the old buildings that is being preserved. And this big, shiny
Yeah.
pharmaceutical building.
Amazing, amazing, all right. Okay, so we can start the question answer session now, right? To
Okay.
Catherine and
Yeah, so the first question is from Yang Qing Hin. The question is how the licensing fee is charged. Is it giving a stake on the company, or the founders have to pay the fee or bond, or it is a mixture of it?
Mostly it's cash. However, the upfront fee which also involves cash to reimburse the university for patent costs, that can be kept fairly low, and then annual fees, which escalate over time while the companies can raise more and more money, such that we understood that a brand new company is not going to have very much money. And so, for example, paying the back patent costs, we would say, you don't have to pay those already spent patent costs until you have raised, say, $3 million in investment capital. You have to pay the ongoing costs, but we keep the upfront low and postpone it. Sometimes stock in the company is part of the deal, but generally at MIT, it's a small amount, maybe 4% of founders' shares, undiluted to a fairly low level of investment. So the share, usually, we knew usually the equity would not be worth very much in the end, because the company would have to raise so many rounds of money. This isn't software, this is deep knowledge, materials or batteries or biotech. So the idea was to make a deal that can be back-end loaded, gentle up front, pay more as time goes on, and royalties on the product would be the ultimate, where if it succeeds, that's the point at which the amount of money can get quite large if it's a large product. So it's again, it's experience with startups and understanding them allows the TLO to make deals that help the company succeed.
Okay, the second question is also about the equity. Does MIT take equity in the ventures that it helps? How does the structure work? I guess you have provided the answer just now, but do you have anything to add on?
No, we don't. We understand that equity is high risk. We're only taking a tiny amount of it, and usually don't make very much out of it in the end, even if the company succeeds. Every once in a while, like once a decade, we will have a fairly nice return, perhaps a few $1 million. And just once, our equity had been diluted down to 0.5% of the stock in the company, but it was Akamai at a time of exuberance in the stock market, and 0.5% gave us $50 million. And my job was to promise the president this will never happen again. But if you do enough over time, you will get some pleasant surprises along with the unpleasant ones.
We have another question from Mr. Lam. Thank you, Lita. In Hong Kong, given the lack of some particular industries like R&D and manufacturing, we have a draft of industry advisors to be board members or senior executives. Do you have any other ideas to assess mentorship for us in Hong Kong? Thank you.
It's a problem. And again, it starts small and grows. One of the reasons that people do this volunteer work, and I've had this question, why does anybody work for free? Is the fact that the mentors are often highly experienced people who've been successful, and many are retired executives. They enjoy learning about new technology. They enjoy the, let's think, almost parental role of helping baby companies grow and inventors learn. So that's probably the major advantage. The other is that when people retire, they want something interesting to do and to interact with interesting people. Well, faculty, students, and other mentors provide that social reward. And for those people who aren't MIT alums, it's kind of nice to tell people you're working with MIT. So the brand helps too, as it would with HKU. So the idea is for the university to make it a welcome place, set up systems that work easily, non-bureaucratically, and then let it be known that if you're a volunteer, you will have a very interesting experience. And then they tell their friends, and that's how the venture mentoring service grew. It's how Sandbox, which now has hundreds of mentors involved, grew. But it involves having an organization within the university whose job is to make it easy and effective for people to volunteer. As for executives, you hope that they can find you. And if you're working with professional venture investors, if you reach that point, they generally have a contact list where they will matchmake there.
Thank you. We have another question. MIT's policy disallow the startups to work in or with MIT laboratories. How does the founders of the startups do the research on the technology? Because it is difficult to find appropriate equipment or laboratory. Thank you.
Well, exactly. And that's what these incubators and accelerators are about. Or if the founders are truly entrepreneurial, and usually they are, they can find it by going to companies in the region that might have them, allow them to use the end of a piece of a lab bench or others. But laboratory equipped accelerators, if you can get one going, and of course they will specialize biotech or whatever, can be very helpful for just the purpose you were talking about. And the university should think about that. But I would recommend that you not do what too many universities do, which is just open up some office space and hope. Okay. And you may decide that your policy will allow collaboration with the laboratories from which the inventions came. Many universities do, and it becomes a matter of having clear policies and some oversight to protect students.
Thank you. So we continue with the question. So the next one is, does MIT provide startups with valuing, accounting, and legal help? Going to VC or investor without knowledge of the value might get ripped off, or some legally questionable deal could lead to a huge issue in the future. Or does the services provided by the incubator or accelerators?
None of the above, unfortunately. However, there are many law firms that will give, if it's a promising startup, at least in Boston, that will give some sort of special deals, low cost, to help startup companies. The one thing we have done, it's not sufficient, but it's helpful, is that the law school at Boston University has a clinic where people from MIT and elsewhere doing startups can ask questions and get a little help, but they will not do they can help you on small things, or they can advise you to some extent on but they cannot do the legal work. So it needs to be found elsewhere. Somehow people manage. But no, MIT does not provide that help.
Actually,
Yeah.
Lita, actually, HKU was kind of involved with the BU. It's kind of learning from a BU MIT legal law school, MIT startup, and collaboration thing.
Great. And who does HKU work with? Or do you have a
Oh.
law school?
Yes, yeah, that's why we were talking about, or I actually did something here too. Yeah.
You do have a law school?
Yeah, we have lost the faculty of law.
Well,
yes.
that can be very useful because it's educational for both sides of the interaction.
Yes,
And so it's doubly valuable to the university.
right. Thank you.
And the coming question is, how does MIT deal with the conflict of interest between the duty of faculty members at MIT and the interests of the faculty members or co-founders in the startup? Thank you.
We have some pretty clear policies, and we rely on the integrity of the faculty members. In American universities, I don't know whether in Hong Kong, professors are allowed 20% of their time for what's called outside professional activities, consulting or whatever else they want to do, write a book. And so it's assumed that the professors in advising the companies are using that time. They are not supposed to be what's called line managers, meaning a boss of anybody in the company. Their primary loyalty is supposed to be to the university. They can advise, they can consult, but they're not supposed to be the chief technology officer or the CEO. Now, when they're tiny little consulting companies, nobody notices. But if it's a large company, if it's a company that's growing with investors and the like, they are not supposed to be manager employees of the company. There also is some pretty good dispute resolution, ombudsman and other things that work within MIT. And once again, the TLO can be influential, not in managing the conflict, but in telling people how to get help. But a lot of it relies on the integrity of the faculty.
Hi. The next question is, are there any tactical advice you have to help overcome the cultural barriers for professors and postdoc researchers to jump out to operate their ventures instead of staying in their academic posts? Thank you.
Well, it's very interesting. Most of our faculty, particularly not tenured faculty, don't leave. They use their consulting time, and MIT has a policy that they can get, if their responsibilities allow, they can get a year or sometimes 2 years of leave of absence, provided that they make sure they're still taking care of their graduate students and other people and other obligations, but they can be relieved from their teaching obligations. And I'm sorry, but the iCloud will not come off my computer, so I'm just going to ignore it. So most of them don't leave. Some do. And for students, of course, we try very hard to say, stay and finish your degree, because joining a little startup company is risky. You want to make sure you have your degree, and if all the inventors agree, we can give them an option that says, we're not going to license it to anybody else for a certain period of time while you finish your dissertation and graduate. But there's no policies. It's just for tenured faculty, it really is a very attractive lifestyle, because you have your professorship, your salary, and everything else, and the ability to continue your research with the graduate students and postdocs. And at the same time, you can participate as a founder. So over the course of 30 years, I think I know of 2, maybe 3 tenured faculty left to be entrepreneurs. Untenured faculty, well, they have to think hard. Which do they want to be? And often in the a need to get a lot of publications and do a lot of research in order to get tenure, in some cases, we advise them that this is not a good time to start a company. You might want to wait. But other than that, their decision, their life.
Thank you. We have one more question. Hong Kong also has a lot of retired executives and businessmen who might be interested to be the mentor for startups in Hong Kong, as well as in overseas. In particular, if the startup intends to cover this part of the world, would there be a channel in MIT to arrange such? Thank you.
Well, we can't do it for you, but the venture mentoring service at MIT offers both courses and on-site consulting to companies, not companies, to universities on how to set up a venture mentoring service in their own university. And I would suggest, if HKU is interested, that they get in touch with Roman Lubinsky. You probably know him, Sean, or just the venture mentoring service at MIT, and they will help you do it, which I highly advise. I think it's been good for the community and good for the university. So, did we get all the questions within the hour?
Actually, I could answer the question from Victoria. Says, as a HKU student, how to get a similar support for startup company like those in MIT. Please come to talk to me.
That's
Well,
exactly
of course,
right. I
you
was
are
going to
also
say,
welcome.
talk to
welcome.
Sean.
That's right. Then also you can talk to Lita, and you are more than welcome to talk to us. Yes. Okay. Well, the other question.
Yeah, we have one more. Is MIT helping startups outside the USA?
No, the startups that we're working with are the ones that come from our, well, from our research that's in the TLO. Uh, if you have MIT alums in Hong Kong, they could certainly, I suppose, tap into the venture mentoring service at MIT. They would be welcome, but how effective it would be, I don't know. But other than that, we can't get involved with other people's technology.
There are still a few questions there, but since it's kind of getting late in Boston, and also again we will have 2 more sessions down the road. I hope we can wrap up for today. Again, thank you so much, Lita, for your inspiring and a very informative presentation, and especially question and answer session, right? And also thank you all, the audience, taking time to participate in this event. And also big thanks to my colleagues here to help. And we look forward, all of you, including, well, of course, mainly Lita, for our next either 2 or few more sessions. Right? Okay, thank you all.
It's been a great pleasure, and it's always a pleasure when I get a lot of questions showing that people are interested and that this was a useful thing to do. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. Yeah, thank you. Good night,
Night.
Lita.
Good night,
Bye.
everybody.